As we mentioned in previous videos, General Motors full-size cars were all new for the 1971 model year after the 1965 to 70 model years were sunset. And for 1971, GM had to come up with some new styling themes across the entire lineup. Now, one of the things that is often not discussed, but people often pick up on, is that General Motors divisions share different types of styling cues across the various cars that they produced. Sometimes this is a product of the fact that designers change between exterior studios for the vehicles, perhaps moving between Cadillac and Buick or Oldsmobile and Chevrolet and bringing some of the inherent DNA with them of their previous divisions. But it's also part of the product of the overall General Motors building and how the design leadership would go from studio to studio, picking various elements that they liked of proposals and moving them to different cars. Here specifically, you can see a proposal for the new full-size 1971 Cadillac Deville. And take a look at a number of elements here, some of which made it through to production, including that torpedo-like body side. Although the door handle was different, this appears to have something similar to the door handle that would be used on the Chevrolets and Pontiacs of that model year. And the square wheel openings would also make it through without the distinctly pronounced wheel arches that some other Cadillacs had had before this. But take a look at the front end on this particular vehicle and ask yourself, does it remind you of any other full-size 1971 General Motors car? Specifically, the headlights and the turn signals integrated into the bumper in that particular format. If you answered that it reminds you of the 1971 Oldsmobile, then you would be correct. For whatever reason, it appears that GM's styling leadership may have seen this proposal in the Cadillac studio and asked the Oldsmobile designers to emulate it on the front end of the 71 Olds 98, which you can see here. 71 Olds 98 itself was quite an attractive car, although it did change styling pretty materially between the 1971 and the 1972 model years, but it clearly got one of its design cues from this early model in Cadillac Design Studio. And here, by the way, is a rear three-quarter view of that same model. Notice that distinct torpedo-like body side, which again made it through to production, but on this particular design, you'll note that that torpedo form extends all the way into the bumper and the taillights. That was not something that made it through to production, and perhaps was rejected as being a bit too extreme. I do find it interesting as well that this vehicle is modeled with a vinyl roof, and that vinyl roof has a carriage bow or faux carriage bow. You can see it at the back of the roof there, something that was a bit of a leftover trait from the early 1960s when a lot of GM vehicles had that, and some of the Ford vehicles even had it in the late 1960s as well. But an overall interesting looking vehicle. The deck lid would get a bit taller in height on the production model. The bumper would be revised. That torpedo body side would be toned down. And certainly the front end would change versus what you saw here, as well as that Chevrolet and Pontiac style door handle. And the daylight opening or the window graphic on the side would also evolve to something that was materially different from this particular cutout that you see here. And here's another proposal for the front end of that same vehicle. And you can see the Oldsmobile style front end remains on this other proposal, but there's also a styling element that's carried over from a particular division's 1970 model year. We'll see if you can discern what that might be. If you said the 1970 Pontiac front end and its inner so-called horns that were inboard of the headlights, that's what is strangely borrowed here. I hope there's not too many 1970 Pontiac fans, because I have to say that the 1970 Pontiac is perhaps one of my least favorite full-size Pontiacs that was ever designed and put into production. And it's unfortunate because it's the only year for the premium fuel, high compression, 455 cubic inch Pontiac V8. But that said, the front end of the 70 Pontiac is just a little bit too much for me, shall we say. And somehow the Cadillac designers here thought that it was an appropriate inspiration to take and put on this Deville proposal. Note here that you can also pick up the hood line, which is pretty close to the production version of the 1971 Deville and Fleetwood series. I should say the Calais series as well. But there is one element that is different, and that's the bevel on the front and around the edges of the hood, similar to the 1971 Eldorado. The 71 Eldorado had a unique feature, and that was that beveled theme that carried throughout the hood and onto the deck lid. And that did not make it through to production on the rear-wheel drive Cadillacs, the Calais, the Deville, and the Fleetwood, that lost the bevel. One thing that the Deville series and Fleetwood and Eldorado all shared in terms of the front end was the lower bumper center bar. That was common across all those vehicles, and the bevel helped disguise the fact that it was shared. That was obviously a cost savings as well to use that same center bar across the three vehicles, but it did mean a very important element stylistically, and that was that the front ends have to have the exact same amount of plan view, or in other words, looking from above and down in the vehicles, the point of the hoods and the bumpers had to be the exact same across all three cars in order to share that bumper center bar. It ended up working out quite well, and I think that the 71 Eldorado and the Deville, Fleetwood, and Calais series have quite a bit different amongst them visually to separate themselves for buyers, in addition to the Eldorado obviously being front-wheel drive versus the Deville, Calais, and Fleetwood being rear-wheel drive. Let's return to this photo once again, and you can also see that beveled theme on the hood of this particular vehicle. So clearly the Cadillac studios were trying to have this beveled theme across perhaps the Deville, Fleetwood, Calais, as well as the Eldorado series. And importantly, the Deville, Fleetwood, and Calais were done in a different Cadillac studio from the Eldorado. They were not done in the same studio. The Eldorado was done in the Cadillac Advanced studio, whereas the Deville, Fleetwood, and Calais were done in the regular Cadillac production studio. It was just thought that there was too much work to redo the Deville and Fleetwood and Calais series all at once for the Cadillac production studio to handle the load of the Eldorado on top of it. Hence, the design task fell to the Cadillac Advanced studio for the latter. But clearly there was some discussion amongst the studios of using similar themes, although it didn't end up on the production versions. I do think that this is a handsome car, and I hope that this particular video provided you some insights into how various vehicles may end up with different styling elements or sharing of those. And like I said, often it's a product of the design leadership in the GM building, walking around and sometimes saying, take that and put it on this other car, as opposed to using it on the vehicle in which it was originally modeled. That was a relatively frequent occurrence. Let me know if you like this type of videos. I think it's interesting to discuss some of these elements in particular, given that we have a number of designers who frequent the program. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching. And until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.